All right, so should I get started?
Yep, go for it.
Cool. So my name is John Ney. I'm a fellow at the Center for Legal Informatics at Stanford. So that's a center operated both by computer science department and the law school there. And do a couple other things that are we can circle back to later related to like investment management, which is in one of the application areas of automating legal understanding, especially with respect to things like fiduciary duty and standards of that nature. But for the purpose of this talk, I mean, the real focus is that we're doing this project where we're trying to take a legal informatics approach to aligning AI. So to kind of like spec out the problem a little bit, because there's a lot of different ways of framing AI alignment, and there's different sort of sub problems. To define what we're going to talk about today is that basically AI is advancing, and that's why this is like increasingly relevant to talk about. And so there's more wide deployment of AI. It's more powerful, and then because it's more powerful and because there's more deployment, it's harder to reason about emergent behaviors, whether that's an emergent behavior of a system by itself, like we see with LLMs a lot of times, but also emergent behaviors as these are deployed and as there's more sort of interacting components out in the real world. And so there's what we're realizing is that there's a couple different futures that we could see, and they're potentially pretty radically different depending on how we're able to improve the safety and the alignment of AI. And in particular, what we're trying to focus on right now is specifying goals for AI. This is hard. One of the ways that we can kind of frame the problem is sort of through a reinforcement learning lens, a decision-making lens that an agent could take. I don't think we lose a lot of generality framing the problem that way. In other words, I think what we talk about today is still relevant when you're really focusing in on not just reinforcement learning, but also self-supervised learning, a little bit on the traditional supervised learning side, maybe not so much on unsupervised learning. But I think in general, taking the reinforcement learning approach of thinking about the alignment problem is pretty productive. And so with that said, I mean, basically the way to define one of the ways of thinking about the problem is that specifying a value of what an agent could take for a particular action in a particular state of the world is really unwieldy beyond a limited set of value action states. So a human specifying it or a human constructing a function that specifies it is really hard to do if we're trying to view a enumerable number of value action states, right? So then we have to train on some subset of states with the goal of, that's the point of machine learning, is that we're actually trying to generalize from that training process into some new distribution or at least some new states with the same ability to choose high value actions according to our reward function in unencountered states. But the function that's subscribing those values is incomplete because we're not able to reason through all the different ways that this could play out in the real world. And then the training process, if there's any realism at all to the simulation or to the other way that we're training it, is sparse exploration of the states. And so for those reasons, specifying the goals is hard. And then that's not even layering on the next level, which is societal goals. So in addition to specifying the goals for more of just thinking about it as like one human or like a group of humans that's themselves very aligned, specifying those goals to the agent is already hard. But now if we're talking about many different disparate agents that may not all be aligned, which is obviously the case with humans, then we have a whole nother issue of how do we look at societal goals and we ascribe values to these state action pairs that are not just values of one person, but are values of society more broadly. And as we deploy AI more widely, that's necessary because we have to consider other people and we have to consider interacting systems. So then the questions become whose views are included in that specification? How do we elicit those views from those people to actually understand what their views are and then encode that into the reward function or other process. And then how do we also aggregate and synthesize those views? So those are just like fundamental questions as we move forward into a societal framing of the problem. We have to come up with some answer to those questions. And the crux of it, the summary is that once we actually deploy AI, it has a course map of like our actual preferred actions as a society they want to take. And therefore, it's likely that there's many actions taken that are unaligned with our preferred path. So that's where it enters into a potential solution or a framework for sets of solutions called law-informed AI. And there's two main components to this. So one is more useful AI. So this is like what a lot of the existing alignment problem is really focused on, which is basically just better specifying the human goals to the AI and having it robustly execute on those goals. And the other one is society aligned AI, which is not as much of the technical alignment discourse right now. But what we're going to focus on is both of those through the law-informed AI approach. So with more useful AI, really what we're talking about is contracts in statute drafting. The process of doing that is actually been refined for centuries, in some cases millennia. And then the interpretation of those things, if we encode the ability to interpret those things into AI, we can better robustly specify what are our inherently vague goals. So to go through some specific kind of like why this matters. So in law, there's already this situation where contracts are entered into every day, where the parties to the contracts are not able to foresee every possible contingency. And so this is called an incomplete contract. There's very few situations where you can have a complete contract. A complete contract is where in the AI world, the reinforcement learning approach, you would specify the value of every state action pair. And that's basically impossible in any real world scenario where you'd enter into any real legal contract. And therefore, all contracts are basically incomplete contracts where there's a lot that's left unspecified. And contracts and legal standards and other methods related to that have developed processes to deal with that. And so we can leverage some of those to our benefit here. And similarly, on the public law side of things, legislators also can't predict all the circumstances that their bills would be applied. And we figured out ways to help deal with that. Again, that comes back to this idea of standards as opposed to just rules. And legal theory has really allowed us to refine through a lot of practical work, a lot of theoretical work, ability to deal with this kind of stuff and generalize expectations to brand new unspecified states to new situations. So that's on the more useful AI side. On the society aligned AI side, this is less of a focus on drafting of contracts and standards and statutes. Is more of a focus on the existing body of law, and in particular, public law, not private law. And so the existing law out there has a lot, it's almost like a knowledge base that an AI can draw from to understand the ways in which humans have decided to basically solve social dilemmas, to interact with each other, to reduce externalities, and so on. And what's useful when thinking through this is what is the existing solution of data sources suggested for technical AI alignment? There's three main buckets. One is surveys conducted of human preferences. There's humans labeling ethical situations that are potentially morally ambiguous and saying this is better than that, this is more ethical than that. And the third is, this is the most common, is the implicitly done way of doing it, which is the beliefs of the designers, the builders of the AI systems. So those are the three main sources today of the data for how you would do societal AI alignment. But all of those lack authoritative source. They're not actually synthesizing the preference aggregation of society of all the people out there and tackling those issues that we talked about before. Whose views are included? How do we elicit those views? systematically, and then how do we aggregate and synthesize them? The existing solutions don't address that really at all, but law does. So law, it's grounded explicitly in a verifiable resolution, and that's one that is ultimately obtained from a court opinion, and short of that, from legal experts. And so if we can harness public law as this knowledge base of democratically endorsed values that are ascribed to state action pairs, this could be a great framework to begin to tackle the societal AI alignment problem. So just to summarize, like, what is law-informed AI, to get a little more basically concise here, it's two things. It's the ability to robustly specify and interpret inherently vague human goals by leveraging the data and processes generated by law today. Those include lawmaking, statutory interpretation, contract drafting, applications of standards, and just legal reasoning more broadly. And then this is using both offline data, so this existing data exhaust that's produced by these processes, and then also reinforcement learning from human feedback from experts like lawyers. And then it's building that into an AI capability that can better interpret our directives. And then number two, it's up-to-date knowledge base of these endorsed values via public law. Because really, one way of defining law, it's the applied philosophy of multi-agent alignment, and it's already out there. There's a lot of good theory about it. So to zoom back for a second on my background a little bit. So what I have been working on for a few years on and off is kind of weekly law-informed AI. And what that can allow us to do is to power narrow tasks. For example, the task of predicting lawmaking activity. And so that's one of the things I've done is release models that are used every day by annually. There's about 10 million people or so that look at these predictions of the probability of a bill being enacted into law. So that's like a really narrow task of what AI can do right now if it's weekly law informed. So now that there's so much great work coming out on more of like this foundation models and large language models, there's the possibility to move more towards strongly law-informed AI, and that can power much more than narrow tasks. So it can power things that are not the topic of today's talk, these things on the left, but it can also power things that we're going to talk about today. So the two things we've already outlined. And on the left here, just to briefly touch upon it, there's been a lot of work about how does law and policy govern AI, and how can AI inform law. So on the former, it's about how can we better enforce law, and how can we do that with these increasingly agentic systems, and how can we get at the humans behind the systems to make sure there's some accountability. So that's important. That's not what we're talking about today, but what we're doing in terms of law-informed AI could help towards that goal. And then AI informs law is about the practice of law or the practice of public policy implementation. And so there's obviously a lot of ways that AI can inform that, just like AI can inform and help human productivity in other realms as well. But what we're going to talk about over here is actually just the core problem of aligned AI defined pretty broadly, not just within the legal sphere. So what we're looking for here is an alignment framework with at least 3 criteria satisfied. So we want a well-developed theory. We want it to be useful for today's systems, but also scale with future advancements. It seems that there's kind of a divide right now within the AI alignment and AI safety communities around like a focus on very near-term problems, which are very important, around bias and discrimination and other ethical issues with AI systems, versus the groups focused on more of the AI alignment framing of the longer-term transformative AI, AGI-esque worries, right? So, but there's not much in between. There's not much bridging it. Potentially, this framework helps to bridge those things because it's both useful for today's systems, but also scales up to being useful for future systems. And then finally, we want this thing to be rigorously battle tested, at least in some form, this alignment framework. And it would be great if, as it was battle tested, it spit off data that we could use that data to actually train machine learning models to advance our goals here. So let's run through these. So the first one was we want a well-developed theory. And we want that theory to be laden with these constructs that are explicitly built to handle this ambiguity of human goals and the novelty that's inherent in deploying these systems in the real world, where it's going to be in unencountered states that the system was trained on and did not see before. So basically, there's methodologies for making and interpreting law that already exist, where one set of agents, whether it's a contract, so they're writing a contract, or it's a legislator writing a bill and turning that into law, they develop specifications for behavior. And then another set of agents, whether it's the parties to the contract or it's the citizens that are subject to the law that the legislators wrote, that set of agents now interprets the specifications of what they should do or should not do in new circumstances. And then everyone iterates. Like maybe it wasn't a great specification of the problem. Maybe it wasn't interpreted correctly, but now let's go back. Let's amend the law. Let's amend the contract. Let's create a new contract. Let's create a new regulation, a new law. And then let's iterate through these three things here in this process. So we've refined that process by doing it many times with attorneys, businesses, citizens, legislators, et cetera, for centuries. So there's a great body of theory there about how to do this problem, how to specify and iterate. And then just to zoom in on one specific example of the theory, there's a lot of theory around rules versus standards. And in the AI world, you could think about this, maybe this kind of maps onto symbolic systems versus machine learning. And so rules are like basically if-then statements. And so it's like, do not drive more than 60 miles per hour. That's one example of a rule. It's targeted, but it's brittle, and we don't know how it's going to play out when there's a lot of uncertainty in different states we encounter in the new world. And so, for example, we follow that rule perfectly, but we had someone in our car who died because we didn't drive fast enough. We didn't write the exception as well, right? So we could start to try to write this out. And as we know, it's just the problem explodes as we try to do symbolic systems in the real world, and we try to write if-then rules for every possible exception that might occur. So then we can take a more standards-based approach to it, and we can say drive reasonably for California highways. So reasonable is a standard that's been applied probably many millions of times within law, and there's certain interpretations of what does reasonable mean in this context. And so if we can learn standards, and then we can even have them be conditional on certain things, like, for example, California highways, we can further target those standards. So what we've done is we've developed these shared understandings of things like fiduciary duty or reasonableness that as a society, we're able to adapt those understandings to novel situations. And even if we haven't specified all the if-then statements, we can still generalize those shared understandings to these unspecified states. So with this a theory of alignment, we want the theory to also credibly elicit human preferences and values. And we want a great solid theory around that legitimately synthesizes them and updates them over time, which is very important. We don't want value lock-in. We want to have something that updates. So democracy has figured that out. I mean, there's a theory for how to elicit these preferences credibly, how to synthesize them, and then update them. Number two, we want something that's useful for today's AI systems, but scales with future advancements. So we want to be able to set higher and higher bars that we place on a system. As that system becomes more capable, it should be held to a higher standard of its comprehension of the public policy that's relevant to that system. And so this could be basically a benchmark. So as we know, like benchmarks in AI research are incredibly powerful for shaping the community. What does the community focus on? What are people doing new research on? Everyone's trying to get a little bit higher on the benchmark and be able to publish that paper. So benchmarks are this like global objective function for the AI research community. They could also serve as a global objective function for the AI technical alignment community, where we can begin to benchmark against legal understanding. If an AI system has that level of legal understanding, then as it advances in its capabilities, it hopefully also advances in its alignment capabilities as well. So to kind of expand on that point, we can move from the left to the right here, where on the top, we're talking about the capabilities of the AI system. It starts with maybe just a simple rule-based system, basically just a bunch of if-then statements. And then we have, the pre-2017 or 2018 neural networks before transformers. And then we have today's foundation models. And then who knows where we go from there. But beyond that, we could eventually bookend the other side of this by saying AGI. And then on the bottom here, we are talking about the legal understanding capabilities of the system. Ideally, these things are lining up perfectly. Right now, the top is further along than the bottom because there's not much research being done here, but that's what we're trying to change today. And then ideally, what we could do is we could then start to define things like AI contract capability is where you're just able to understand contracts as an AI system. You're not able to do much more than that. Here, AI standards is, okay, you can actually understand human standards like reasonableness or fiduciary duties. Here, we're trying to master entire legal practice areas, like everything about securities law as an AI system. The AI public capability would be where an AGI system fully understands all of public law, how to interpret it with all the previous precedents, et cetera. So what does this mean in terms of benchmarking? So right now, the way to think about sort of AI contract capability, what we're trying to benchmark to there is an understanding of a contract, an implied contract between an AI and the human it's conducting tasks for. One way of thinking about this is it's basically just the contract I might have with a simple supervised learning model is that I wanted to have some level of out of distribution robustness, some level of out of sample performance with new predictions. As we move further to the right to the AI standards, in addition to that contractual ability for it to just do that simple relationship with me in terms of its ability to make those predictions well, I also wanted to be able to actually understand these standards and understand more about law and how to interpret human directives. And so we can begin to create these benchmarks that benchmark the system as we go forward. So for example, if an AI system was a fully autonomous investment advisor for me, I would not want it to just understand, what's my risk preference? What types of things do I want to invest in, et cetera. I also wanted to understand unsaid things in our contract with each other, things like the fiduciary duty of, I'm not going to specify all the ways that it would not be able to uphold a duty of care or duty of loyalty to me, but I wanted to exhibit some understanding of that standard. So when it goes off in the real world and it's making autonomous agentic decisions about, I should buy this or sell this and I should invest in this, I wanted to uphold those same things that I also want right now a human to uphold as my investment advisor. So just a quick point on, as we're scaling this up, we always want to be grounding back into human judgment. So this is part of the potential issue with other technical AI alignment approaches, where it's really hard to have it be, as a system becomes very capable, to have it be grounded back into what humans actually care about. As a system becomes much more intelligent than us, how are we able to bring it back down to what we care about? And so no matter how far to the right we go here, under this framework, what we're trying to work towards is the ability for the ultimate resolution to be in law. So at first, we're way over here where we just have a human asking a human lawyer for advice, but that human lawyer today, they're not the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority is a court or the black letter law from the statute. And so no matter how far to the right we go, that is still the ultimate authority. Even if we have AGI and the extreme capabilities of general intelligence to sort through of a bunch of stuff for us and understand law, it still needs to circle back and figure out the ground truth in the that court or the regulatory body for that ultimate determination. So the next part of our what we're looking for in a framework is it's even better if we're indexing into the amazing advancements that are happening in AI, and we're kind of riding the wave of. So it's even better if the alignment methods can just ride that wave of better and better AI capabilities that are happening on the general AI research side of things in the world. And so there does seem to be the ability to do this here. So what we found is that language models, when they're trained on legal text, this has not been done at a very large scale, but it does, at least right now, slightly improve performance on downstream legal tasks, sort of just out of the box. And so what we would expect is that as we do this better, as we better structure that training data, we could get even more gains there. And then also we see really strong capabilities in analyzing citations. This hasn't really been applied to legal citations yet much, but it's applied to Wikipedia and other places. We could probably port over those capabilities like right away into better finding relevant legal precedent or having AI systems do that. And then also we've seen that language models can generate really persuasive language, and that could help AI understand and learn from legal briefs, which are just kind of persuasive documents. In general, as the state of the art becomes more advanced, what we've seen is that contract analysis across a variety of tasks has improved. And so what we're expecting is that just the work that's just automatically basically being done by the amazing AI community right now, that's going to continue to power improvements in the legal AI understanding almost off the shelf. But of course, like the more work that we can do that's targeted, the more that we can even further leverage that. And on that note, I mean, what we want to do is we want to leverage some data specifically from legal data and legal experts to further boost our legal understanding capabilities of our AI systems. And so what would be great is if this framework that we're seeking was also battle tested and in a way that produced data that machine learning could actually use. So the documentation of law is pretty extensive. We can go into later, like sort of all the different data sources here. But in general, there's kind of like three high-level categories. So one is human legal experts. So this could be basically like human in the loop, like almost like active learning or reinforcement learning with human feedback. There's 1.3 million lawyers just in the US right now. So there's a lot of human capital there. It's the second category are there's systems for training lawyers that are basically kind of, you can think of them as simulators. And then the third category is legal text. So there's just a ton of text data out there from court opinions, from legislation, from regulation, et cetera. And then on that legal text and on these other types of data, there's two categories of training models that are really interesting right now. So one is self-supervision. So as we've seen, obviously, large language models applied across general text from the internet works really well. And then we've also seen as people have applied to more curated data, like, for example, dialogue data leads to better dialogue models, technical math papers from archive, training on those leads to better mathematical reasoning. So there's reason to believe that focusing in on certain types of data in your language model training can help with certain types of downstream tasks. And so the goal here is to leverage a lot of the legal data points to build sort of a law foundation model through self-supervision. And you can imagine sort of a spectrum where you have completely unstructured data, like just text from the internet, and you're training a large language model on that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have code. So like, there's the Copilot model. And in somewhere in between, you have something like law, where it's more structured. Legal text is more structured than text from Reddit, for example, but it's less structured than Python code, for example. And so we can learn from what's been happening at these other ends of the extreme and build a foundation model that's a little more targeted here. On the fine tuning side of things, we found that that works pretty well for fine tuning existing large language models onto data for a lot of different tasks. And ethical reasoning is one that's interesting here, especially where there's been a few models recently that did really well at picking up on sort of common sense human moral judgments. And that was through a fine tuning process on that smaller data set. And so that's actually really similar to the process of how you train how you fine tune a large language model on legal standards. It's very similar to the process of applying it to common sense moral reasoning, like we saw with the Delphi model and other work of that nature. but it's different from a normative and from a framework perspective, because again, what we'll get back to later, and what we've already touched on a little bit, is the idea that basically that data is not grounded in any authoritative resolution. It's just kind of random people, usually Amazon Mechanical Turkers. It's just sort of their judgments on particular moral situations. And then also in addition to those, we can also do better prompting engineering from the legal understanding angle, and try to really engineer the prompting processes from the approach of legal reasoning to better perform. So there's now that we've kind of run through all of the different parts of the framework that we're seeking, and why that the legal informatics approach might be the way to solve for all of those, there's two main last things I want to cover before we go to questions. So one is this idea of contracts and standards better helping us teach machine learning models to understand our ambiguous directives. And then the next thing I want to talk about is the society AI alignment of how do you use public law to better figure out how to ascribe values to state action pairs from a society's perspective. So in the first one, the humans are still going to be doing the lawmaking or the contract drafting part of things, right? But what we're trying to do is we're trying to imbue into a machine learning system the ability to take that lawmaking and that contract drafting in, and then reflect that in the behaviors going forward. So how do we build the AI capabilities for that interpretation part? It's machine learning on data and processes from law and simulations of law, and specifically large language modeling on this self-supervised learning approach we've already talked about. It's the human legal expert prompting we just mentioned. It's also reinforcement learning in legal training simulators. And then finally, what's probably most relevant to today's group is the reinforcement learning from human attorney feedback with natural language interactions with the language models. That would be the ideal way to do it. Maybe we could do it through sort of preference ranking, but it'd be awesome if we could leverage actual natural language feedback from the attorneys, and then apply that more broadly as the ability that the machine learning model learns about how to interpret ambiguous directives. So finally, is the society AI alignment. So how do we leverage public law, and how do we pull all this together, this whole framework? So one way of thinking about the framework is the contract drafting and standards interpretation part, where we can't ever have complete contracts in the real world. So we have incomplete contracts. There are implied contracts between us and between our AI systems, and AI systems have learned how to fill in the gaps of the incomplete contract by using our ability to specify standards and other more ambiguous directives, and then do a good job at implementing that contract. So that's the more proactive way of doing things. That's us telling an AI agent what we want it to do to productively accomplish something in the world on our behalf. The other way of thinking about it is there's a constraining component. Okay, now that you're running around doing who knows what with all these AI agents, how do we reduce externalities of this person negatively affecting this person, or this person's AI being unaligned with that person's AI? So that's where public law comes in. And so out of all possible actions, there's some set of actions that are actually permitted under public law. And so that helps constrain things to be societally AI aligned. So that's how you bring together that idea of the private law through the learning of the implied contracts with the public law to bring it all together. So there's three contenders besides what we've talked about here. One of which is what we talked about here. The other one is descriptive ethics and prescriptive ethics. So descriptive ethics is machine learning applied to human behavior, human decisions. So there's some existing really cool work on this. The great thing is that's real data that we can elicit from preferences, from surveys, or from just interacting with humans in general, that gives us something that we can give a machine learning model and actually learn from. The downside is that what we're relying on there is either observational data, just descriptions of what people did in the world. And a lot of that is going to be largely unethical, right? A lot of what people do is not something that we would want to necessarily teach a machine to do. Or it's going to be surveys of common sense judgments of people to try to elicit ethical behavior. but that's unauthoritative. That's illegitimate. Like who said that those people were the boss? Like, why do they get to decide what's ethical? And it's almost immediately outdated. Like as soon as we elicit those things, maybe things change. Maybe people have a more nuanced and better view about what is ethical tomorrow than they did yesterday. And then it's also disembodied. So when we ask people certain questions in surveys, what we find in like the social science literature is that like without putting a lot of more into context, what we get out of that simple decontextualized question answer is something that doesn't really apply to other scenarios. So that's the problem with descriptive ethics. It has some good things, some bad things. Legal informatics takes that good thing. It still has a lot of real data that we can use machine learning for, but it doesn't take that bad thing. So prescriptive ethics, the good thing is this is the idea of actually using machine learning, symbolic systems, or whatever it is, take a more of a top-down view. Descriptive ethics is bottom-up, learning from data out there. Prescriptive ethics is top-down, here's the ethical theories. It's utilitarianism. It's a lot of other philosophical ethical theories. And so if we can embed that into AI systems, we're pushing the AI towards our better selves. So that's a good thing. But the downside is there's no empirical data to learn from. It's probably going to be a lot of just symbolic systems, a lot of if-then rules. And there's still no democratic legitimacy to those philosophical theories. They might sound great in theory, but a ton of people disagree about those theories. And there's just endless debates in academia about what's the right theory and is an ensemble of theories? Great. How do you ensemble the theories together? How do you weight each theory? And then still you have no mechanism for updating the theories over time for better reflecting people's preferences over time. And there's no way to actually democratically do that deliberatively. So that's the downside there. So legal informatics takes the good thing from prescriptive ethics, the good thing from descriptive ethics. It has just one main sort of downside, which is that public law is more about what not to do rather than what should we proactively do to improve the world. That's the downside here. What are the other downsides? So maybe it's a preference aggregation downside that AGI could have solved better. So law, we all know it's not a perfect aggregation of human preferences. So we're not endorsing current law as the epitome of the best thing ever. That's not what I'm here. But it is the best that we have. But then the question is, okay, can't more powerful AI help with better preference aggregation as we get to, maybe we get to AGI one day and it can do that? Maybe, but the problem is that there's no accepted process to get buy-in from all the other humans. That's just not something that you can find a technical solution with. The best thing that we have today is not the best, but it's democracy. What about other downsides? So does that contractual view on better human AI alignment, does it require an intentional stance? Does it require some sort of actual mental states of the AI for the AI to be able to say, oh, I'm part of this contract? Maybe. US law informs code, as we've talked about, but how do we do this broadly? How do we do this globally? Maybe evolutionary psychology could help with what are the cross-cultural things that we all share that are in all these legal systems that are shared. So that's a big open question. And then, as we just talked about, it informs code more through negative than positive directives. The human AI contract thing that can inform what goals we should proactively pursue, but how far does that get us? I don't know. And then finally, we need to potentially systematically weight that empirical legal data that our systems are learning from based on its expressive power defined broadly. So what do I mean by that? I mean, there's potentially some obvious glaring problems in existing law that we may need to intervene and say we need something that says let's not train on that part of the law because it's very biased or something of that nature. And so that's another open question about how to marry the ethics approach with the legal informatics approach. Okay, sorry, right? One last thing, give you some more limitations of this approach. So maybe government becomes increasingly polarized along partisan lines. And then the laws are just a worse and worse representation of this aggregation of citizen values. Maybe, but actually I think there's what we found is that everyone would have said, oh, during, in 2019, 2020, this is only going to get worse. It's actually gotten better. There's more bipartisanship. We have an incredibly resilient legal system in the United States. Okay, well, AI might find loopholes as it gets smarter. As AGI is scaled up, there's ways to figure out all the different loopholes. That might also be true. But this is a well-known problem. The system, what we've seen so far is legal systems organically adopt and adapt solutions to that problem. So that's another unknown. So I'll stop there and we take any questions and love your feedback on anything.
So I have sorry, with someone else. You can go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, great talk, John. But I guess, so, democracy has also been called the tyranny of the majority. And other countries don't have democracy. Like let's use Iran as an example. How do you envision this working with, I guess, non-Western values, right? Because China's huge, India's huge, and I'm sure they have a lot of different views than the Western society would expect on a lot of different things.
For sure. It's a great point. I think this is one of the biggest things to grapple with, like from a conceptual perspective about this legal informatics approach. And I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, someone mentioned to me that basically one approach is to draw on the literature from evolutionary psychology of law and look at what are the strands that are almost universal. Doesn't solve it, because that's only like for those parts that are universal. The parts that are not, I don't know. So I don't have a good answer for you. Any other questions or feedback or anything?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Suppose that we have a large language model which has amazing legal understanding. It's able to like understand, train like all this case data, able to like do the normal things that a lawyer or judge could do in terms of like what they would write. How do we use this to regularize the actions of another model, which is, let's say, trained to like output a sequence of actions, proposed actions in pursuit of a goal?
Yeah, so you're saying, how do you use one model that has that understanding to constrain another model? Is that the question?
Yeah, essentially, especially if perhaps, let's say the model with legal understanding is trained on like legal case data, but not necessarily trained to like read a sequence of actions and think about the consequences.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that I would envision that is you kind of have like this like an oracle, like a counselor model that's that legal AI model that understands things a lot better. And then you have the other model, let's call the other model A. So model A, as it is traversing the world, what it would like to do is it ideally it has some prediction model, some prediction functionality that's able to predict when there is a high level of ambiguity in its alignment with its either with the contract that it is working on for a particular principle, or with society more generally. And then as soon as that model has, or that capability is predicted a high uncertainty, then it's able to call on that legal AI model. And then ideally, all this is being done through natural language text in a way that's interpretable by a human, because then as needed, we can go in and we can interpret what's going on there and read the transcript basically of that uncertainty and how it was communicated and how the answer was communicated back. Of course, we're not going to read all of that, all those logs, but if all that was being logged, then that provides a great source for troubleshooting basically the systems. And in terms of how it's constraining its actions, there's a lot of different ways to constrain the action. So one is, it could be basically the legal AI component could be saying that here are the actions that are available to you, and now you choose one based on whatever utility function you were you were doing. So it could kind of just constrain the space of actions. It could weight them differently. It could be part of the training process itself. So it could do sort of different shaping of the training if it's a reinforcement learning process. So there's a lot of different ways. Like I'd love to chat with you later about like, I think I have like 10 different ideas of the different ways that you could shape the process. But just high level, those are a few of them.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so can I don't think this is too adversarial because I'm probably just confused. But this agenda is for helping in the situation where when we have a model which is able to follow a set of values given by some sort of data set, process, or something. And you're proposing like here a law is proposed as this set of values which gives the maximum amount of which is relatively consistent as opposed to like whatever the designers of the AI think of as the values or reinforcement learning for the human preferences and the reinforcement learning for human preferences and so on. But I thought, like, in my view was that the hard bit of this whole, like, this is important. So having a good value system is important, but the hard part is getting a powerful enough machine learning system to consistently do anything. Like the technicalities of like any sort of value system. Like, is this is this correct what I said or not? Like, just trying to clear up my confusion about what this talk is about.
Yeah, that's generally correct. I think there might be a confusion around so like how are we even specifying like what our goals are? So I think that's part of what we're trying to do with this whole part about the more useful AI part, is we're trying to say, set aside the societal values thing for a second. And if we're just trying to more robustly specify what the intention of an AI system should be, we can draw on things like legal standards. So for example, it's too hard to create a reward function for a system right now that like incorporates every possible thing about how it should interact in the world as it's managing my money, right? So like I would love to be able to say, hey, you should just have a fiduciary duty to me. Like, so that's how it works with like humans, right? So it's like, I'm not going to say like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. I'm going to say, have a fiduciary duty to me. And then here's my specific goals. Like, I'm trying to retire by this age and this and that. So the point is that if we can leverage if we can teach AI these legal standards, then that helps with just the basic problem of like, as we're trying to deploy relatively autonomous systems, how should they navigate the world and how should they make trade-offs in certain situations that they've never seen in their training data. So that's part of it. And then the second part is what you mentioned around the actual like societal values. And that part actually comes in as systems are much more capable. So like I talked about how we move from the left to the right here. So I don't think that to your point, like the hard part is like, how do we even imbue anything in systems right now? Like the understanding of the public law, which is just like, it's crazy. It's like, there's so much like to figure out about all the different regulations and legislation and court opinions. That part is going to have to come along as we progress our general AI capabilities. Does that help at all?
It clears a bit, yes. Just to make sure, I did not dispute the societal value of this at all. I think it's one of the better ideas I've seen about how we structure. Like, if we have let's say very powerful systems, like ruling a lot of aspects of our lives, like how to structure them so that no one is hurt. I think like getting them to follow the law is good. Yeah, I'm just conflicted about this. The first thing, like the actual safety thing, where you kind of basically assume that this understanding of the law and following the law from orders is kind of a proxy, if I understand it correctly, is kind of a proxy for general alignment of to instructions, like if or values. So if it can follow the law and actually do what it's intended to do, then the law is quite vague about a lot of like and complex and stuff. And if it can do that, then we have kind of confidence that it will be able to do like to generally have these values and follow them consistently. Like it, yeah, I don't know, maybe. You haven't made any very strong argument why this should be the case if you train a transformer or something or that, and why it should be following values more consistently than in some other experiments smaller experiments where you're trying to imbue some values, for example, reinforcement learning for human preferences, and you want to guarantee that it will follow them even when it's off distribution and so on. Like, I'm not sure that this resolves that part of the hard problem, but maybe I got too confused here. Yeah. Anyway, if anyone else has questions, then it's better.
Well, but I'll just address one part real quick. So I think when basically, like, I don't agree with a lot of what you said. Like, I think that effectively, as the capabilities to align with human preferences, as already like talked about in a lot of the technical alignment literature, of a lot of it is around, we compare two different common sense moral judgments about this scenario versus that scenario. That scenario is better than that one, and can the model learn a capability to generalize to some new comparison and say that one's better than that one, right? So like, I don't dispute that capability of a transformer model to do well at that task. I think that's great, and I actually think what we can do is that we can apply a very similar approach but instead of training it on random human surveys, we can train it on legal data to do something very similar. And the point is that is a better grounding in a more legitimate source of data, because otherwise we're going to get into a lot of arguments of, oh, were those human surveys like the right human surveys, or were they constructed the right way? So I think like you and I basically agree that like as we increase the capabilities of general AI capabilities, that will be useful here as it is useful with other approaches.
If you don't mind me stealing a bit of more time, like this, so would some of your view be invalidated if at some point, like in the next few years, we got a significant evidence that RLHF does not really work off distribution, like when that there is no way to generalize that with that sort of precision that we need, like that it generalizes like okay, like it's imbued value, but it still strays off the path, and there are some reasons for it still strays off the path, where like in the vast possible space of all the situations it can be in. Like if that happened, but this hasn't happened, but if that happened, like would your proposal for this first part, not the society level, but the human level, be invalidated or not?
So yeah. I mean, I think what we're saying here is that if we're able to teach the system a lot of the legal reasoning capabilities and the legal standards understandings, it reduces the probability of what you're saying occurring. I think that's the argument here, is that like, yes, if that happened, if it totally was sort of misaligned at some, maybe like an inner alignment problem or something like that, then that's a huge problem. Like, and we're not helping with that problem. But that's like, I think that's a separate kind of argument for what we're talking about today.
Yeah, but just making sure, so this which problems this solves, like this.
Yeah, this helps solve the specification problem. of like, how do you specify our inherently ambiguous goals as humans? How do you better specify them?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I missed the first 10-ish minutes of the talk, so maybe you said this.
Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, in the first
yeah,
10 minutes.
sorry.
So I know there was another question. Someone else had a question.
I know in chat there was a question. Oh, sorry, something else.
Oh no, yeah, I think I saw something. Was it in chat or?
Might be the one in chat. So I'll just read it off for everybody.
Thanks.
So the question is, are you aware of any benchmarks / data sets on which the current large language models exhibit inverse scaling? So I guess the idea here is that as we get larger and larger language models, maybe the models might overfit to some legal aspects in the text, and it can bias things in certain ways that are negative. So
right. Yeah. I'm aware of in general some of the inverse scaling results that have just recently come out, but as far as I'm aware, none of them are about legal capabilities or legal reasoning. But I could definitely see that being a possibility here. I'm just not aware of it empirically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like something that can be actually experimented with today. So
yeah,
if anybody here wants to try it out, that'd be cool.
Yeah, please try it out and let me know. I'd love to hear about the results.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, in general, if anybody's interested in following up, like, please reach out. And like, we're going to be doing a lot more work in this space, not just theoretical, but also empirical. And so please let me know if you're interested in collaborating on that.
Definitely. Will these slides be available? Because they're super dense and there's a lot of information here that I think some of us would like to digest more.
Yeah, I can share them with you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Where should I do that in the Discord?
Yeah, in the Discord. Yeah, that'll be easier because most of us are from the Discord.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So if nobody else has any questions, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This has been fun. Thank you for your questions.